Hello, welcome to the Central Area Senior Center. I'm Diane Ferguson, the Executive Director here. I like to tell people I'm a native of Washington State, come from a military family. I grew up in Europe, but came back to Tacoma when I was in 6th grade, and I've lived here ever since.
Hello, my name is Tisha Marie. I use she, her, and queen pronouns. I like to address people as king, queen, and royalty to say that I see you beyond the limitations that society has placed on you. Our history did not start in shackles, but on thrones, leading nations, leading villages, and pioneering in arithmetic, science, and astrology. So I see you beyond the society limitations. So that is me. I'm also the founder of Legally Black, which is a nonprofit organization here in Tacoma, Washington.
Hello, my name is Jordanos Teferi. I'm Eritrean American, and I'm also the executive director of an organization called Multicultural Community Coalition, and I'm very excited to be here.
My name is Jordan Jeffries, he, him pronouns. I am the co-founder and co-director of Think Ideas and Artisan Activism and a bunch of other things that I won't mention right now, but yeah, we're a Snohomish County organization representing the interests of the Black community. There aren't many of us, but we believe that that is a reason why we need as much representation as possible. I'm glad to be here. So the community identified approach that was the most attractive to me was civics outside of the political system. I think that the political system is open source. I think it's something that you can learn, that can be studied. It's a system. It's identifiable. There are people who have entered it. There are people who have flourished, and I think that our community specifically, I think that if we can consolidate what our beliefs are, if we can get to a point where we are agreeing on a larger scale about the things that we want to bring into this political system, then we gain the power that we need to actually make change. I think having representatives that are lone in some cases, percentage-wise, that don't actually have the support of the community and actually have the excitement of the community behind their initiatives, I think that they're going to hit a wall eventually, and they're going to have to depend on allies, and they're going to have to depend on people that are not a part of the community to help to fulfill their mission. We have enough people, we have enough power in our community, I believe, to get behind each other and to push these initiatives forwards without permission and without having to compromise our position or try to help people understand. Nobody understands us better than us. And I think the fact that we're wasting energy on trying to get the world to buy in to us I think it's a waste of time. I think that we buy into us, and then you decide to support our initiatives or not support our initiatives. And that's going to say a lot about those people who either choose to or choose not to. If we make it about supporting us, that's a popular thing. Oh, I support you, but I just really don't like this initiative. If we can make the two synonymous, if we can become the initiative, if we can all agree on what we're pushing forward, then we're going to see where the rest of the country stands when we try to do things for our community. And I think that that's important.
That's beautiful.
So that's really interesting because I was thinking about what you said, and I know that I've been involved in government as an advocate in the nonprofit sector for most of my life, and working in coalition with lots of different groups. And I think when I came to the Senior Center in 2014, what I realized was that for many years, I see Black people, African American people taking the lead in helping other groups to move forward, and that when we want them as allies, they haven't always been there. So one of the things that became really important to me in the advocacy of trying to own the property that this building and the Senior Center has been in since 1968 was to no longer associate ourselves as primarily being with people of color, but to specifically call out, we are working on behalf of the efforts of Black people, African American people, people from the Africa diasporas. And I think that surprised people and shocked them a little because we had been in coalition so much. And it really has been beneficial because no longer could they they, being the public sector, the city of Seattle, say, well, we're doing this for all, people of color. And no, people of color own property. Asian Counseling and Referral has a wonderful building, and other people of color have these wonderful buildings, but we all started out at the same time, and the transfer of property, the ownership of property did not come to us in the Central District. And so by us claiming that together, Africa Town, Burt Bard, ourselves, it really helped move the forward to take it from being a people of color issue to this is what's happening in the Central District with African American led organizations.
Yeah, I know, I agree with you. I actually think each of these approaches to civic engagement are all interconnected. The one that spoke to me the most is changing the narrative and shifting the narrative. When we tell our stories, you mentioned it, we should be the experts in our own experience. Yep. And the reality is we are, but assuming that responsibility, assuming that position in society where all stories go through us, come from us, and are told to us. Because I think once we begin to tell our own stories, it'll change the way we see ourselves, the way we see other people, and the way other people see us. It'll also impact how we heal throughout generations of trauma. It'll also impact how we show up for policy resolutions. Anything that we do, it kind of gives us the need to recognize our strength as an individual, as a people, in numbers and collectively. So I think changing the narrative and shifting the narrative is going to be the most impactful. I think each of these approaches are significant and vital. But for me, the one that spoke to me the most is shifting the narrative so we can be more available and purposeful in our thoughts and effectiveness moving forward in all these other spaces. But a perfect example.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point to say that they're all interconnected because we would need to have all in place. The one that resonated with me is the funding of communities to plan and lead. And the way I think about that is, yes, we need civic engagement to be more involved or to take ownership of whatever initiatives there are that we want to call our own, but also push for, and to also get the outcome, like you were saying, and for the senior center on behalf of the African American community. But what does it mean to be at the table now? And I know it's read as making sure we fund communities, but whether we're funded or not, what does it look like to be at the table? And I think about collaboration with our institutions, our systems. And so what does it mean to actually have community voice at those tables and being able to put forth the community-driven solutions that we want to see, because we are the experts. And so that's really what I've seen with this pandemic and other other challenges that we've had. If we're not at the table, they're deciding for us.
Right.
They're trying to determine what's best for us when they should be just accustomed to listening to us and saying, this is what community is demanding, this is what community is asking for, these are the solutions. Let's now craft the policies and practices that reflect those. And so that's what I think of a lot, because I've seen where being at those tables, it makes an impact. I know the system is slow to shift, but that's why I feel like the more that we can be there, even if it's just a couple of us for now, it's just vitally important.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it too, just having the representation as much as possible in all of these spaces, and not just being at the table, but being a part of the process to implement the changes that we're fighting for, and being able to be comfortable sharing those needs in a space. I think a lot of times we have policymakers who do not leave room for people like us at the table in the first place because it makes them uncomfortable. A lot of times us as Black and brown people, whenever we're looking to change something, we always pay homage to how far we've come, what has been done before us. And so with that, a lot of times people who are not Black and brown, they're listening to us and they assume that as an attack on themselves. When we start addressing what was wrong with the system in the first place, what has not protected us, what has not empowered or enlightened or liberated us in different ways. So not only being at the table, but whoever is already at the table to make space emotionally, mentally, and physically for everything that we're bringing. I think that's important.
Love that.
I think it's important because when we go to meetings and we're talking with public policy makers, I think it's very important that we bring our authentic voices to the table, and we bring our experiences of who we are, and that we change the dynamics of even how the communication goes. One of the things that I always say is I've been to so many meetings where people don't greet each other. They don't ask you what your name is, who you are, where you come from. And so I've been in many meetings where I'll just stop them and I'll go, I would like to know your names. Who do you represent? What should I know about you? Do you drink coffee? Different things like that, because I find environment so unwelcoming. And one of the things that we've done, I'm talking about the senior centers because this is where I'm at now, but there's about 52 senior centers in King County. And one of the things that we actually have done workshops and trainings on is how do you invite people into your house, into your senior center, that they feel welcome. You have to greet them. People will say all the time, you're one of the nicest places for us to come to. But I think that we cannot be afraid to policymakers, mayors, council people, to let them know that we want to do business a little differently. And let's start by saying hello and what's your name and welcome into my space, or to honor. We're here in the Leschi neighborhood, which was home of the Leschi natives. And so we have to do that in honor to the Duwamish people. And so I think that's one of the places that you can start. Because the other thing is, if you're not careful, people will co-opt what is authentic for you, and they will define and tell you who your leaders are, as opposed to your leaders coming up and being authentic and part of your group.
Yeah, I think it's important to excuse me, to include that when making space, like you mentioned. Introduce yourself. Who are you? I think when we realize who we're talking to, it'll dictate how the conversation goes, because kind of what you mentioned also, how are they showing up for us? What are they doing? How are they moving? What are their business practices? So when we ask to be at the table, who are we at the table with? How well do we know them? Are we prepared for that? And then for the younger generation too, to recognize that these changes do not happen immediately. We live in a society where everything is instant gratification at your fingertips. And so to let them understand, like, okay, we've gone so far, but yet we still have so far left to go. And I think a lot of times, especially today, we have people probably, what is it, Gen X, Z? I don't even know. I don't even know which one's which, but anybody that's under 30 right now, right? They think everything has to happen right away.
Yeah.
Right.
And to show that this does take time, and just because it takes time doesn't mean it's not effective.
Yeah.
I think that is something that is missed a lot of times in younger generations today. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case, but now we're seeing that. We see it in social media. We see it in the brief moment of marches and protests in 2020, right? There are people who are marching in 2020 who are marching in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and are still marching today. But that one group of people, okay, it's tired, it's played out, I don't want to do it anymore. It was fun while it lasted. I couldn't get out the house because it was a pandemic. I just needed something to do. But knowing their intentions behind it, I think you both spoke to that, what people's true intentions are. Your intentions will determine how long you're in this fight.
What I'm picking up from all of that is the importance of relationship building, the fact that you should do that. That's just the way that I'm sure most of us are like that, or I can probably speak for the Black community to say that's an important thing to do, just to make certain that we're being authentic and not only welcoming people, but just how we relate to people. And then just going into what you're saying in terms of how long it takes once you do develop those relationships, just sticking with the whole institutional partners or the policymakers, then it makes for a better partnership if you have that good partnership that's happening. And then I think what it does is once you're there, because it does take so long, and in all likelihood it may not be the same people that have helped to give voice to some issues who are going to then be needed on the implementation side of those policies. And so what does it look like to maintain those relationships and then to help others who come after us who are going to be joining that phase of implementation, because it does take so long and we need to hold them accountable. And so that's what's coming forth for me, which I think is a beautiful point, especially the relationship building part, because I think in some of this work, especially when some of us are sitting on the institution side and others of us are wearing the community hat, it's almost like we're, even if they look like us, it's almost like they against us, and just to make certain that we're all human and we're all after, especially those black and brown folks working at these institutions, they all want the same thing.
Right.
And the better relationships that we have, the better we can convey the importance of those policies and practices that we want to see in place that benefit us.
Yeah.
And so I love what you all are reminding us of, just those little things that we forget.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and that change is always constant. I always think that a win today doesn't mean that it is steadfast for tomorrow, and that we have to also be prepared for that everything is fluid in some ways, and that things can change based upon who the new players are that walk into the room and sort of what their agenda is. And so that's how come we have to be very prepared in terms of what is our end goal that we seek, and to realize that things, like you said, are not immediate. And I think, especially with older people, I was looking at the report, and one of the things that I saw was that on some levels, older and senior people are not as optimistic about the future as young people are, because they've experienced lots of things and they've weathered the storms, and there's an expectation on their part that those storms will come back again, and that you just need to be prepared to withstand them. And part of that is just being very versatile, knowing how to do lots of different things, because always I think what we learn as African American and Black people is that if the unemployment rate is 10%, it's 17% for us. If if poverty is at $47,000 a year in the city of Seattle, then people, African, Black people, people of color, understand that they've been living below $47,000 a long time.
Yes.
And so I think one of the things we just always have to do is make sure we're bringing other people along, young people, so that they understand that they can withstand the changes that will come over time, and that a win today doesn't mean that it's going to be a win tomorrow.
I love that you brought that perspective, because I don't think we focus so much on the more seasoned generations of people who have experienced this in the past already. We have the younger generation who wants it right away, and we have a generation that has seen too much time pass and not enough effective change take place. And so where do we bridge that gap of the different generations? Part of that, I think, has to happen when we willingly pass the torch to the next generation, and that generation has to receive that torch with acknowledgement of what has already been done. I think oftentimes there's a disconnect where everyone wants to do it themselves and we aren't moving collectively. You mentioned how getting different funding is extremely important, but having unrestricted access to where that money goes, I think, is really important. And I remember in a previous conversation, you were mentioning how it makes it really difficult for some organizations and people to obtain different lending when people have already established relationships. So I'm kind of like tying this back into established relationships, how sometimes we see some detriment that takes place where some folks don't want to extend more relationship opportunities with other generations. And I don't know if you want to pick up on this, because you just had a lot of points to share.
Well, so let me. All of you said so much I agree with. I think, and let me insert a little optimism here.
Yeah.
I think,
Please.
Yeah, I think that the younger generation and the older generation actually have everything in common when it comes to the movement. It's all about how information is processed. It's all about how they approach it. Where relationship building face to face and getting people's information from them is a huge priority to the older generations. The younger generations have now the ability, because of the connectivity we have and the accessibility to each other we have, to do research ahead of time.
Right.
And then the luxury of seeing if people are walking their talk,
Yeah.
So it's all there. I think that the disparity, that gap that needs to be bridged, is that it's called activism for a reason. You have to be active. There is, and you can throw any word in front or behind of activism that you want to, but you have to be active. And once you're active with a cause, you'll realize that there are tiny victories along the way to the big victory that keep people who are in it involved.
Right.
The instant gratification, everything you need, it's there. You know, you push the button, the little, you know, you get the pellet. You know, everything is there. It's all about how it's presented. And what happens is that you get. Well, we do it this way. We do it this way. There's nothing new under the sun. Information is still being passed and processed, and I think that all that needs to change is the way it's explained. I think those victories exist. I think the way that initiatives and everything are processed, it is boring. It is tedious. You know, it takes. You're excited about a grant, and then 18 months later, you might actually start to see money from the grant.
Right.
How do you keep people interested in that dead time? You know, and I think the tools are there. It's all about how we apply them.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought of, though, with what you said in terms of just a win today may not be a win tomorrow, this is where I think the civic engagement point that you were making comes in, because who gets to step in and hold that next leader accountable? They may not want to be held accountable for the former leaders or representatives' promises, but what does it look like to push that new leader that may not be as responsive, I guess, to community?
Yeah.
You know, how do you push? And that's where I really think civic engagement is so vital.
Right.
Hold them accountable. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
And I think to the point is that the leadership has to be broader. You know, this concept of that the leadership all has to lead up, and it's one person. I think it's shared leadership. You know, what I found in our movements to galvanize people and get them excited was to have leadership across the board, and several different partnerships are recognized as providing the leadership, because what you really need to be successful is a coalition of players that will come together and decide that this is important enough for all of us to work behind and work with, and that my background is in public policy and administration, and we always talk about collective action, that singular, unorganized individual effort is not as good and as successful as collective action that we do together to move us where we need to be.
Not as
It's power
long
to the
lasting.
people, right? Not power to the person.
Yes,
Right?
power to
Yeah.
the person,
Good point.
Yeah. And that's another thing. It's to somebody who is not politically inclined, to somebody who does not do what we do, that isn't always in it. It seems too big. You know, you've heard the term. You've heard people say, "My vote doesn't count." Me as an individual, what can I do? And people feel like they have to clan up, you know, in order to make something happen. When actually, all you have to do is just approach your representatives, or find a way to approach your representatives, because ultimately the power is with the people.
Yeah.
That person can't, I believe, and this is me being very sympathetic to politicians, this is rare. I'm glad we're getting this on tape.
I was going to
hear
say,
it.
glad it's
I'm
recorded.
glad you're recording this. But I think that some of the fault lies with the people when a representative is not doing their job. And I think all the fault lies with the people if the representative is allowed to keep doing their job if they're not representing the people well. So I don't know. I mean, with social media, with the way that people can put their voice out there to the world now, I believe that maybe there is an angle that we can get people to understand that they can leverage their individual power to make big change. That's the exhaustion, I believe, of the younger generation. I think that they think they don't matter, and they think that if they're not rooting for the right team, that they'll never be heard. When actually, you do matter as an individual. You just have to care about it enough to put it out there to the world.
Yeah. I think there needs to be integrity behind it also, where when you give a platform to everyone to have a voice, that sometimes that becomes the problem too. If everybody has a voice, then no one's listening to the next person who may have more expertise, more knowledge, more lived experience than themselves. Not to say that everyone's voice doesn't matter, because I really don't want that to be the takeaway. Everyone's voice matters. But in certain spaces, recognizing when someone else has a strength that you do not possess, someone else has the knowledge that you do not yet know, that is when we need to take a seat back and say, hey, let this person lead, let this person pave the way, and we'll follow in that light. Because speaking to what you said, people kind of find their little niche, find their group, and move in that light. there are so many organizations that exist already where we don't have to keep forming new ones.
Yeah.
You know, let's focus on what is already there and use the resources that are readily accessible to you and use that as a vessel to get the changes that you're looking for. Hopefully anybody that is in a society or in a community where they don't feel like they have a voice or they don't feel like they can be heard, you got the phone right here. You know, you could look up an organization, look up somebody, or follow a hashtag and see who is doing what and where they are. And it's easy to connect, speaking to what you mentioned too, like where everything's right there and super accessible.
So to me, dreaming is about having a vision for your life. I can remember as a small child, I was actually very young, and I think Kissinger was the Secretary of State. And for some reason, I found him interesting because he got to travel a lot. I like to travel. So I said, oh, that's the job I want when I grow up. I want to be the Secretary of State so that I can travel and public policy and all of those kinds of things. So in preparation for that, I learned Mandarin Chinese and studied some Japanese and read books and have degrees and different things like that because I was going to be the Secretary of State. Now the reality is that when I got to college, Ronald Reagan was president and he cut the budget for international development agencies and stuff. And so I couldn't get a job there. So I came back and I worked with the city of Seattle. But the thing is, I had a vision for my life. And that dream helped me to help other people dream. And especially working with young people. I was a school teacher for a while, middle school, high school, boys and girls clubs. And what I learned was a lot of kids didn't have a vision for their lives. And you need a vision for your life to take you to the next step of where you want to go. And so I think both as individually and then working within our organizations and within our community, we have to teach people how to dream. I'll make it more tangible. This building that the senior center had been in for 52 years and had never achieved the ownership of it. People told me all the time, that's not going to happen, Diane, because we've been here for 52 years. They don't listen to us. We don't do any, we haven't gotten what we wanted. And I was actually surprised by that because I think you can get anything that you dream about if you put a plan of action together. And so basically that's what we did. We had seniors that were in walkers and wheelchairs going to city council meetings on a regular basis. Everybody wrote letters. We galvanized the community. We had to raise some money in a quick amount of time to show that we had the ability to raise money. And so collectively, we trained people on how they could do advocacy for in their own interest for something that was important. But the thing that got me the most was we had to help them to dream that they could own the building. And it doesn't seem like a big thing, but it really is a big thing because there's a lot of people who have no vision and they have to get galvanized and somebody has to help them realize that they can have a vision and they can accomplish what they want to do. And I think that's what we have to do in our organizations. But for me, because I knew how to dream as a child and my parents and my family supported me, okay, Diane, I remember when I was in 11th grade and I wanted to go to Taiwan and learn Chinese. My mother said no, and my dad said, well, if you can convince your mom, then you can go and I'll help you do that. So I think that's what we need. Personal visions that can then be translated into organizational visions, advocacy to make a change for what we want in our own communities.
I'm writing that down because it's very important.
It's kind of funny. Yeah. And it all started with Henry Kissinger.
That is so impressive.
I love that. Again, just notes that I can look people up. I was not around when he was the Secretary of State.
But that's
so
okay. He used to be on TV every night talking about, I just went to Russia and we did this and now I'm going to China. And I was like, who is this man?
All those places.
Is it all right if I piggyback on this? Or are you prepared? So I dream of, and you actually spoke to it, to know how to dream is something that not everybody has the luxury to possess, or the freedom to be able to, the space to be able to cultivate those dreams into reality. I dream of restructured systems that are rooted in empowering and protecting people as opposed to sustaining certain demographics of people based on race and socioeconomic class. That is something and what you mentioned kind of relates a little bit to my own. Sitting there watching the TV screen, listening to the Secretary of State. Here I am a few years after you, and just
You're
a few.
being kind.
And I'm also seeing policymakers in the way that they move. So I truly dream of honest government and earnest intentions within our systems, and I don't think we have that yet. I shouldn't say I don't think. I know we don't have that.
I agree.
So that is something that I dream of, dismantling systems that are currently in place so we can replace them with systems that protect people who have been left behind this entire time that we've been established as a nation. So that's what I dream of. I think one of the ways that I try to manifest that is with the language that I use and holding people accountable, people who I work with through the nonprofit organization Legally Black, where we are having conversations with policymakers, elected and appointed officials, and holding them accountable by saying, this is what you said to the people. This is what you said you wanted to do. This is what you sounded like. Now let's check your implicit biases, because something is hindering you from better serving people who are impacted negatively by these systems that you are continuing to uphold. So what are you doing differently? What can you do? And so having that conversation with people is one way that I feel like I'm slowly manifesting this dream of earnest intentions. The other way is intentional language when I'm speaking to myself, when I'm speaking to other people, because other people are taking notice to that. How do I treat myself is going to give people permission on how they can treat me. How I treat the person next to me is going to give people permission, or the assumption that they have permission to also treat you that way. So using intentional language and behavior, those are the two ways that I feel like I'm manifesting that dream. Hopefully it comes to fruition in good time, but right now it's a slow effort.
Picking up on what you said, the way I've been thinking about like the dream, the civic engagement dream is just, you've kind of said it, what does it look like when it actually works? And you were talking about that, like the power of the individual and the fact that you shouldn't be shy to step into, just reach out to your elected representative or just to get involved. And so what does it look like if we have representatives that cannot be held accountable or are not doing what they said they would be willing to do, and to actually vote them out? And that takes everyone engaged in the process of civic engagement to actually vote, to actually, just collectivism, as you were saying as well, like to show up en masse and to do that. And I think part of it doesn't, obviously the system doesn't work that way, because we have all of these representatives and policymakers who are not serving us well with what you were saying. It's working just for a few that continue to have the system work for them, and then the majority are being left behind. And so if we had a system, and I think about particularly the federal government system, where you have representatives that serve for decades, and it just blows my mind. And the system has become more and more broken, yet we have the same representatives that we, the people, vote in, or truly it's because we don't vote. And even when I think about the U.S. becoming majority and minority state, yet we have the representatives don't reflect that. It's mostly white men still. And so, I really think about what does it look like to have that system where we could just say, you're not doing what you said you would be doing, let's vote you out. And not to have that level of instability, I guess, and just to have that revolving door of folks just changing, but really just to make certain that you have responsible representation in place so that we can see things changing for the benefit of those who need it the most, is the dream. In terms of manifesting it, I really think it's my notion of collectivism, and because I really don't think that showing up and talking to an elected representative as an individual works. Having met with them, where they're just like, you're just one voice, I'm not interested in that. The ones that are actually listening, right? They say we need greater voice. And so what does it look like to have that greater voice to try to institute certain policies and practices? And recently, within the realm of equitable development, that's part of the work I've been doing, where we've shown up. It's similar to what you were saying, Ms. Diane, with actually getting the senior center and banding together with various organizations to talk to the elected officials. Recently, we did something like that for the King County Equitable Development Initiative, trying to mimic what's happening in Seattle, to have the county set up a program like that. And the only reason they took us seriously is because we had 40 plus organizations coming to the table and talking to them and convincing them that that needed to be done. And we're lucky in this situation. I don't think it always happens, but I mean, so little baby steps towards that, and hopefully the fear is that we don't go backwards when we get new representatives. And so again, what does it look like to hold them accountable and to just have them move out of their seats when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing?
So the dream that I see is control over our story and the way we see our story and the way we tell our story. I think that there are versions of that out there. I think that we've been trying to achieve that for a very long time, but I also think that our story is, as African Americans, is very American, and America likes to have control of its stories. And unfortunately, we're learning a version of the story that doesn't give us the tools that we need to have a. We don't. It doesn't give them their Kissinger. It doesn't give them their examples of going to a representative and trying to speak to them and it not working. They don't get to see that this fight has happened, and that it's been won and it's been lost, and that representatives aren't always representing. It's looked at with this beautiful, kind of veneer on it, where if we were allowed to tell the story from our perspective, if we were allowed to have the perspectives in this room even tell some of the stories that have happened to us in the version that has not been filtered by our system, I think just that history would naturally give birth to all of the leaders we're missing, it would give us control of our trauma. We wouldn't be traumatized. We wouldn't have to sit in a room. My personal example is that I was one of 3 African Americans in my entire town, and having to watch Roots in middle school, and having to do these things, to have a movie tell the story of slavery, where the textbook couldn't tell it, and to have to experience that with no preparation in a room of people that did not look like me. Right. I think that in my case, it made me go, "What's the truth?" Because I recognize that guy from. Who's the dad? And I recognize him from Reading Rainbow. You know what I mean? And isn't he on Star Trek? The Next Generation, and I'm like, that's Geordie LaForge. But so having control of that narrative, and I'm talking not necessarily on networks that are just designed for us, not from the most accomplished people that are in control of media and writers. I'm talking about community-based. I'm talking small level. Getting involved with not necessarily the curriculum, but at least the amendments to the education that's already being put out. Right. I'm not saying dismantle the system. I think that would be a long-term dream. But I'm not saying do that. I'm saying to amend the current education and the current media and the current everything that's being passed down to inspire a generation to change things because they're fully aware of what needs to be changed.
I love that. It kind of goes back to the first topic we were talking about, is just the different approaches to civil engagement. What can we do to continue to maintain the attention span of the people, and what efforts are we going to make moving forward? I want to just piggyback a little bit on what all of you have said. Extending that dream of a truly earnest and honest government system, I feel like that includes it being made up of people who truly value Black people, as opposed to appropriating our culture, our history, our style, our language, our music, our physical appearance, our hair, and erasing the origin and calling it their own. Because what ends up happening is you have a system designed by white men, for white men with a 4th grade education, and that is still being enforced today. Yep. And we are the most educated generation of people that have ever existed on this earth, and yet we still hold true to the values of people who had barely an education and took over a country that was already ran and already had a government system and people and places that worked. The system you mentioned, your Adonis, that we don't want people to look at the system as being broken, and you mentioned how people will look at maybe their vote doesn't matter. I don't think the system is broken. I think it is operating exactly as it was intended to operate, to continue to sustain and oppress a certain demographic of people, Black and brown people, specifically Black people, and it just so happens that anyone else who's not visibly identifiable as white is also impacted by that system, but it was designed to oppress Black people, is working. You know, from our education, from our healthcare. You know, I think we talked a little bit about it where, you know, Black women particularly are misdiagnosed at a higher rate than any other person on the planet. We're perceived to have more strength, more ability. We can endure more pain.
Yep.
So we go misdiagnosed most of the time, and then we die from diabetes and you know, heart issues and right. You know, we're getting hysterectomies at a young age. You know, like just so many things end up taking place because we're misdiagnosed, and that comes back to the systems that were put in place to keep us where we are. We were test subjects. We were not seen as human beings. We were not seen as human beings when it came to voting rights, owning property. You know, there are still deeds and titles. If you look up the chain of title, that shows that we were not allowed to have property sold or resold to people of color or immigrants up until as recent as the late 60s, 1960s. So that's 50 years ago.
And not in certain neighborhoods still.
Yeah, I was going to say, some of those laws are still in the books.
I was going to say in Washington State, those laws are still on the books because of redlining that happened here in the Central District.
Exactly.
And I know people took them to court to see if their house was one of those identified as in a red line area. And the judges said no against that because that was a part of the history.
Right.
I think actually there's a fundamental flaw in our Constitution that codified inequities to certain groups of people, Black and brown people, to women as well, and that if you look at how elections happen and that two senators are elected from each state, what that means is that the majority of people who are voters are not entitled to have that system changed because a state like California gets 2 senators, just like a state like Delaware or Vermont or the Dakotas that have very few people. So the inequities are set up in the Constitution.
Right.
And so some of that longevity of senators that should have been gone a long time ago because of their unprogressive policies, their non-acknowledgement of how the Constitution is not fair to people of color, to Black people, to women, talk about the importance of the Constitution. And you know, studying public policy, I figured that out really early on. And so that something different has to happen. But I think one of the things when we talk about our organizations and the resources that we need is that there's also not always an acknowledgement that we have more resources as Black people than we've ever had in this country. My favorite thing is when, now my mind is going blank, but my favorite thing was when the Los Angeles Lakers got the title, and Trump had said that they could stay in his hotel, and then LeBron said, no, I'm not going to stay there, and I'm not even going to go because I don't want to meet the president. And somebody said, well, that's awful. He turned down Trump's offer to stay in his hotel. And LeBron said, well, I can buy my own hotel. I don't need to stay there. And so I sometimes
Not the room. He said, I
can buy the hotel. And I think it's really important because sometimes we don't acknowledge our own resources. So again, I'll bring it back to the senior center. But when we had to raise money really quickly, the thing is there are plenty of Black people in the Central District that has money, and they don't necessarily connect their money to their organizations. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to acknowledge that we have resources and that our resources can benefit our own people and our own communities. And sometimes what it takes is that we go and meet one-on-one with those individuals in our communities, you know, the lawyers, the doctors, the marketing people, and all of that have resources that don't translate into contributing to organizations and activities that benefit Black people. And so that was one of the things that we had to do in terms of raising the resources that we need to even have a seat at the table, so that we could be competitive to say we can take the ownership of this building and we can take care of it and be good stewards and not let it fall apart. Because we have the resources in our community to do that. And I think that one of the roles that we play is that we have a facility and we rent our facilities out to the people who can pay, but we also make it available to other nonprofit organizations and community groups that can come in and have their meetings here. And we charge them $35, for up to 3 hours. So that's like $10 and 33 cents
That's
an hour.
really nice.
And so I think sometimes we don't acknowledge our own resources that will help us to get to that implementation plan, because we know that it takes resources to meet, to gather, to have food, to put great minds together. And some of the things that one of our nonprofit organizations, a Black nonprofit that has a lot more money than we do, I won't mention them, but they gave us $10,000 to start our organizing effort to acquire this building. And so we don't have deep pockets, but we have enough resources that we can give somebody $1,000 to help them do some planning. So I think sometimes I'm an optimist by nature, but at the same time, I also know we have resources, and sometimes we count ourselves out because we won't go to our own community to get those resources, and we don't help each other enough.
That's a good point. It is. And that kind of speaks to you talking about building relationships. Part of the way we can get access to these resources is not being afraid to put yourselves in front of certain people and just saying, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we're hoping to do for our community. Here's the way that we think you can contribute. Are you able to? Or if you're not, do you know someone who might be? And kind of just keeping that momentum going.
And can I add on to that? I think one of the things that holds organizations back from putting themselves in front of people is that they feel like there's a certain way that they have to be in order to do that. They feel like, I gotta put my blazer on, and I gotta be a businessman. I gotta use big words, all that. One of the first things my organization, one of the first things we decided when we started meeting, especially with city officials, was that we were not going to change an ounce of ourselves. Not to be disrespectful, but to show them this is us. We're not going to walk in with our briefcases and then you see us on the street and we're completely different people. We are going to come in exactly as we are.
What was that like?
Well, I think this is the most stressed up I've ever been. And I mean, meeting with mayors, it doesn't matter, representatives, we dress the way we want to dress. We talk the way we want to talk. We like sour gummy worms, and we will eat them in a meeting. It's what we do. And it's not, once again, it's not to be flashy or disrespectful. It is to say that Black men are feared. And I think that the more that we can be authentic to ourselves as Black men and present ourselves as we are, to their faces with no fear, maybe they'll get used to it.
Yeah.
Because the fear is based in
Here.
that's what they see, and they fear that. Why would I hide that?
Right.
If I'm trying to represent who I am, why would I hide that? I think that if there's younger organizations, older organizations even, if there's anything I could get across is let's stop trying to be what they want us to be. If you think if their expectations of us are awful, our behavior based on the way we look the way you look and show them that they're wrong. Don't try to fit into that box.
I love that.
Shed those stereotypes.
Exactly.
Interesting notion.
I heard Steve Harvey the other day, and you can cut this part. But I heard Steve Harvey the other day on TV saying that what young Black men need to do to be successful, and he started telling them what color suits to buy.
Oh, wow.
And which I rarely do I let him stay on the TV long enough to even say that. But seriously, I was confused because the identity kit of a young Black person is extremely important. We love fashion. We love to express ourselves visually for other people to see. And the fact that there's the belief that you need to throw on something that is standard in order to be the best version of yourself is extremely damaging. I think that there's something to be said about somebody who wants to, who can look the way they want to look, say what they want to say, and be okay with it.
Right.
And I think these organizations could take a page out of that book.
I think there's, I think I can see on both sides of that. I agree with you wholeheartedly that we should be able to be our true authentic selves in our appearance, in our language, in our behaviors, in our purpose, and what we're fighting to bring to the table. I think, and I don't know what clip you saw, but
It was
but-
probably Family Feud or something.
it might have been. I mean, he does his thing. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves as well and say that there has become a standard of acceptance in America, and that American acceptance is whiteness, and that is what we're trying to remove and make room for us as well. Because when the standard is whiteness, you have people who, let's digress for a second and remove Black people. Let's talk about Hispanic people. I have friends who are from different Latin countries, and their grandparents dye their hair, blonde hair, and they're unintentionally telling their younger generations that you are only going to be accepted the closer you are to white. So you're subconsciously telling people in nonverbal communication that the whiter you are, the more accepting you will be. So when you hear Black men, particularly like Steve Harvey, saying you have to wear this in order to get a job, in order to show up, it's because they were raised in a culture that only accepted them the closer they were to white. We're trying to slowly shift from that. My dad has, he has long dreads like yourself, and my brothers all lock their hair. And I remember at the time, his wife was like, "No, I don't want my sons having locked hair." And my dad was like,
though
"What?"
Dad did.
Like, "Do you see this? Let's swing it around." But she was afraid that they would not get the advantages of somebody who had more accepting hair to white people. Because recognizing that white people were in positions of power at the time that my brothers were going to private schools, at the time that they're going to be looking for jobs. So we have to appeal to them. That was the assumption. That's the thought. I think we're slowly shifting from that, where we can show up as ourselves. And I love that there are forward moving organizations and people like yourself and like all of us here that are like, hell no, this is who we are. This is how we show up. This is how we're going to be. And just because you're intimidated by it does not mean I'm intimidating.
Yes.
I am somebody who is truly authentically myself. How you feel about it means you have to address your own demons and your own biases. I am who I am, and I'm proud of that. And you should be proud of who you are too. Just because I'm proud doesn't mean I'm diminishing who you are or I'm disregarding how you show up. It's just that you need to move over and make space beside you for someone else. And so I love that your whole group is like, no, this is it. This is who we are. I love that.
All of this makes me think about what you both have said in terms of just understand, well, and even you, Ms. Diane, in terms of like understanding history and just knowing your narrative, the story of, like you were saying, just what took place, so that we can do things differently. And so even when I think about showing up as your authentic self, and when you were talking about the Constitution, because I was like, of course that Constitution didn't see us, because it was white men who came up with the Constitution, and they still have issues with the amendment. So, but if you know that history, and if you know how that evolved, and you're going to do things differently now, civic engagement looks different, and just even the sheer desire to show up as your authentic self, that starts to manifest itself, because like no more, right?
Right.
But we don't live in that, I mean, fully, right? Because like you're talking about, it's just assimilating. And as an immigrant, I can say that, where it's like you come to this country and it's just first of all, when we were trying to be our authentic selves, when I was a kid in this country, going to school, like whether my mom dressed us in our traditional wear at times, kids made fun of us. And then it was like, oh no, we can't do this because we're different. We stand out. And so over the years, I've appreciated that people are like, oh, we value culture, we value difference, and all of that. But that wasn't my experience growing up, because people, like particularly other young kids, made fun of you because that's what they learned at home. So I just think of the whole narrative, history, and just particularly the point about trauma, just like just knowing about past trauma and knowing that we don't want to relive trauma now, which oftentimes we do as Black people with what happens within this system. That's the powerful part to me, because then we would ask for different, we would show up different, we would demand different. And so,
I think it takes a lot to have personal power. And you know, I can say that I got a lot of mine from my family because they always supported us. When I was in 6th grade, I was the only black person in Tacoma, Washington at Lowell Elementary School. And I had no black teachers. I had no other black students. There were no janitors. And I remember when we were learning about the Moynihan Report and about how black people didn't have families and different things like that. And I kind of sat there and thought this was really strange. And I told my parents about it. And my parents went to the school to talk to the teachers and the principal to challenge that they were teaching that to us in the way they were teaching it to us because they represented a black family that loved their kids and all those stereotypes were negative. And that's what I remember about my parents. They're deceased now, but they did things like that for us. And so I think that it's really important that family and friends and aunties and nephews and all of that do that for each other as black people. And in my mind, I never think that white men want me to be in charge of everything or will support me. And if they do, then it's wonderful to be an ally. But if you look at what's happening in government and different things like that, they know that for me to win, they have to lose something. They have to give up some power. And so that you can't be afraid of that. You just need to acknowledge it can be very difficult. But the thing is that their mind and their concept is if we get more black women elected or more black people or more Latino people or whatever it is, I'm losing something.
Lessen
So
them.
I'm going to hold
Yeah.
on to as much power. I'm going to lie. I'm going to cheat. And I'm going to do whatever it takes for me to stay in power. And if you know that that's what you're up against, it gives you a target and you don't have to be scared of it.
Yes.
Right.
Agreed.
Right.
Because we can't go into it thinking that because we come in the right suit and with the right haircut and all of those things that they're going to listen to us. They're not going to give, and we have to
great point.
organize and
Yeah.
engage
shuck and jive.
and bring people to the table with us, have partnerships in order to get what we want because they don't like to hear this, but the Constitution was not set up for us.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so that's not how it's going to be gained because Delaware is still going to have the same number of representatives that California does, that New York does. There's no reason that the person who wins the most number of votes
not the
shouldn't be
popular
the
vote,
one
right,
that's
yeah.
not elected.
Right.
Great.
So that's
Electoral
not going to
votes.
change. We're going to have to change that in a different way.
Absolutely. Thinking about personal growth, professional growth, and community growth within the last 5 to 7 years, I've learned to better understand and value my voice and presence in predominantly black spaces and in predominantly white spaces, where I'm no longer focused on making sure everyone around me is comfortable. That's not to say like I aim to displease everyone, but I've accepted the fact that I will make people uncomfortable sometimes. When I was younger, I had this idea that in order to be accepted meant you had to be liked. So I always wanted everyone to be happy around me. Everyone had to, feel good if Tisha was around, or know that if they weren't feeling good, they're safe in my presence. But that was a lot for me to take on, where I am holding everyone else's issues, and I don't have a space to be my true self coming forward. So I think, and then I realized too that there's no growth when we remain in a stagnant place, when we're just constantly comfortable with what's familiar to us and what we are ignorant to. Because there are a lot of times that we just stay in a space of ignorance and bliss, and we're just, hey, this is it. But over the last 5 to 7 years, I realized that there are a lot of things that need to take place. And I'm looking at my note cards too, because I want to make sure that I don't forget anything. But for me, it was, yes, recognizing that I'm going to make people uncomfortable. And accepting that without shame. I think a lot of times that we, particularly black and brown people, think that when other people are uncomfortable, it makes us feel bad. We have to then try to make them feel better. And like it just becomes this sick cycle, and no one's ever healing. Everyone's just constantly blaming each other for whatever negative emotion they're feeling at the time. These last few years of my life, I've taken real ownership into how I show up in different spaces. Professionally, I've realized that I can't control everything. I can't control other people. I can't dictate how they move and how they show up. But I will say that I've been able to identify how people move in their business practices, and that alone shows me what I need to know about them and whether or not I am of value to them. And that's something that took some time to experience. I'm switching jobs for more autonomy, not having to dress a certain way or wear my hair a certain way. I remember going to work and I have really big curly hair. It's a good thing. I like it. I can't wear this hat though if my hair's out, so that's where I slick back. But I remember when my hair's out, people always want to touch it. They want to, and I feel like I am. First off, you're not at a zoo, and I didn't give you permission to touch me.
That's what I tell my daughter.
Right. I loved when COVID came because everyone maintained boundaries. I'm like, you needed a mandate to back up? Like, come on now. Like, leave me alone. But now, like, I'm recognizing that, okay, not only do I need to understand who I am and where I am in these spaces, but understand where other people are too. I might be the only Black person that these people have ever worked with. So they're looking at me to satisfy or not satisfy. Well, yeah, maybe that's the right word. Satisfy whatever predisposition they have of Black people. And if I fulfill that, it's like, okay, I was right about them. And if I show them something different, they hold me to be the one person that represents the entire race, and that's not fair either. So professionally, being comfortable telling people, hey, I do not represent everyone. If you want to learn more about Black and brown people, women in general, the LGBTQIA community, like, you need to speak to other people. You can't just look inward to me. And being comfortable saying that and articulating that in a way that is not deemed as an attack, but as a necessary voice, so people know that there are options for them to be able to experience those learning opportunities. I hope that kind of gives a little bit. I say a lot of things.
Well, I think in our family, I had a fun family where we were all very different astrological signs, some earth parents and fire children. So I always admired that our parents could deal with us. But one of the things we often said was that we know everything about white people because we've studied them and we've had to learn about them. They know nothing about us because they haven't been interested in learning about us. Wow. And so when I walk into a room, that's what I bring with me, is this rich history of understanding history and the role that white people have played in terms of colonization and all of those different kinds of things. And so I think the first part of my career, because I'm much older than all of you, is that I was always the team leader. I was the team leader for all of the coalitions of Asians and Latinos and Black people and whatever. And what I learned was that if you look at history, is that Black people have always been the team leaders for civic engagement and the changing of public policy that benefited everybody, and that not always have they been allies to us when we called upon them or would have benefited from them as being allies. So one of the very conscious decisions that I made, because I had never worked in a Black organization, I had always volunteered, but a conscious decision was come to this Black organization to help rescue it from where it was at financially, in terms of not having a building, in terms of its finances. And so I made a conscious decision that I was only going to work with Black people and Black organizations. And if that allowed me to be in partnership with other BIPOC communities, that I would do that, but I wasn't going to be the team leader anymore. And I did that because our community needed our help. And I think that that's okay. So that's one of the things that I've learned on a personal level, is that, I tell people all the time, is that, no, I'm not going to take the leadership role because I'm needed right here in my community, because there's a whole bunch of inequities that should have been resolved by now that still exist. And I think that that's just important to acknowledge and to be very conscientious about it. And we've changed our language at our organization, and it's been very beneficial, but I also see that as a part of the healing process, because sometimes I'm from Tacoma, and when I was from Tacoma, they'd always go, well, Diane, you got to come back and, work in Tacoma. And so I said, no, I'm going to be in Seattle because my brother and sister is working in Tacoma. But I think it's really important that we come back, and that all of our intellectual wealth and knowledge and skills can benefit our communities where we're at.
I love that.
I'm glad you brought up this whole notion of just coalition or partnership or team leader within the BIPOC umbrella. And I just want to pick up on that before sharing. And I especially think about it from the time of the racial reckoning. First of all, I'm new to community work, relatively speaking, for me, and so I had to learn. I had to learn a lot in terms of just like the systems and how things get done, and community engagements, partnerships, and just the way in which our city, our county folks talk here, being a progressive city where it's just everybody says the right words. And then particularly just saying, we, like, on behalf of BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which, the way in which it sounds good, because the way in which it's supposed to work is you're elevating Black, Indigenous, and then BIPOC. But what you see in practice is that's not the case. And I can admit that for me, especially being new and just and coming from the corporate world, I was like, oh, it's great for all of us to have sit under this big umbrella and just to work on behalf of all. But I think what slowly happened for me and really took shape with, like I said, with the racial reckoning that took place, is just to find my voice to be able to say, well, you guys keep saying BIPOC, but really there's no prioritization of the Black and Indigenous part. And if anything, even following that time period where you could see like community engagement or grant opportunities, where even the county declaring racism as a public health crisis, you're just like, oh, things are going to happen now. They're going to shake things up. But as they started putting out information, it was just like, oh no, we have to go back to this BIPOC to make certain that we're just really trying to capture everyone, cast a wide net, versus really just trying to say those most impacted by racism. And even that was too much. And so I just grapple with that while also coming into my own to be able to now say unapologetically, no, this is who racism impacts. This is what this needs to look like. And I often say, honestly, I'm not talking about me when I really say, we really need to focus on, just sticking to Black people, we really need to focus on Black people. I say, not folks like me who immigrated here just recently, but really the African Americans who have been here for a long time and have been systematically just oppressed. And so I just love that you brought that up, because that's one of those things that I just feel like in this progressive city, it's just kind of like we use a lot of words, and equity is another one, but that's, it just does not trickle down to who it's supposed to in terms of in practice. And so I think for me, what I've seen in terms of just like the time that I worked in this space and engaged in civic engagement, is just you have to learn, you have to build your relationships. It takes time. And then getting involved, there has to be that intentional interest in getting involved, because it really, really does take a lot of time and a strong level of commitment. And then the thing I would say is like just acknowledging also the privilege that we all have to be able to be in these spaces, because we are. I'm sure we all walk in and say we're speaking for the voiceless, and we're speaking for those who may not be like who are not able to yet engage. And so, what does that look like? Because how do you authentically represent those folks who aren't at the table and, who don't have the privilege that we carry? So I try to carry that with me while at the same time, probably I should do this more often, just acknowledging that I may not know what, like having to go back and just make sure that we're also just listening to those folks who are not at the table. And I think with life and just, sometimes you have your community voice in terms of the work that you do, but it's not like you're saying, actually, it's not like we represent everybody.
Right.
And it's just like you have to serve that reminder to just say, this is a perspective or this is a lived experience I'm bringing in, but there's likely a lot more that you could be listening to, or a lot more folks that we could have at the table.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what's coming up for me.
Do you mind if I jump in for a second just to
I'm
comment
good.
on
Yeah,
that?
I'm good. Yeah.
You mentioned two things that I think are extremely important. One, addressing BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and we get hit with this through Legally Black because we represent the best interests of the BIPOC community. However, there is a priority order. Our name is Legally Black. Black is in the name. Black is an acronym, obviously, for Brave, Lifted, Altruistic, Creative, and Keen. But there is a way where we can honor each demographic separately when appropriate and necessary, because we don't all have the same lived experience, the same culture, the same language, the same negative impacts of the systems that we're all here to change. So when I hear, as a Black person, and I'm going into a predominantly white space and they say, hey, we're doing this for the BIPOC community, I know they don't even know what that means. Because if this white space, you should be saying specifically who this space is safe for. Because if it's a safe space for Black people, where is the representation for that? If it's a safe space for Indigenous people, where is the safe space for them? If it's a safe space for Asian, Hispanic, Latino, Pacific Islander, people of color, like that is a separate group, separate demographic, a separate ethnicity. And so when we say we're representing the BIPOC community, and I can only speak from the perspective of Legally Black right now, everything we do, we know first negatively and most negatively impacts Black people. And then it's the Indigenous folk, and then it's everyone else. So if we're fighting these systems that are designed, I think we mentioned it earlier, that are rooted specifically in oppressing Black people, and it just so happens to have that trickling down effect on everyone else, we need to be mindful in our forward thinking, and even when we're in our written language for contract changes, that it says Black and not BIPOC. It has to say Black people because the Constitution said Black people. So we need to bring it all the way back. And once that is changed, it'll have a positive trickling effect for everyone else thereafter. So I fully agree with everything you were saying. As far as personally representing the people, I just want to be clear in case it comes up, anybody who wants to learn from this shared dialogue, that in the workspace, if you are the only minority in your workspace, make sure that your colleagues and your coworkers know that you don't represent the best interests of everyone in that space. But in policy changes, like you're going to politicians and government officials, and we're here, and maybe you don't have 40 people this time, you only have yourself. In that space, you're absolutely representing the voice of everybody who's not present. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where people aren't listening to you, call me. I will pull up and we'll get everybody up in there. But we just need to make sure that when we're talking, like you said, when we're talking about BIPOC people, this will impact BIPOC people, but the focus is Black people here in this space. I think that needs to be an important distinction moving forward.
Really quickly, as you were speaking, it just occurred to me, and we didn't mention this, in terms of thinking about oppression and in terms of just thinking about racism, so much of it is rooted in anti-Blackness, and we don't talk about that. And it's just a lot of other folks think, and that's where people think that, oh, if you just concentrate on these people, then it's taking something away from me. But if we really think about the root of like Indigenous erasure, or just in terms of just racism as the birth of racism and what that looks like, it's really, really rooted in anti-Blackness. And if we can take care of that, everybody else will be taken care of. But folks don't think of it like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Exactly.
I think past 5 to 7 years, what I've there's two things specifically, and all of you touched on them at one point, which is why I think this is a great panel. It's the first one is have the conversation. I think that this is born from the fact that we started protesting. Our organization was birthed from consistent protesting for almost a year. And what started to happen was that we had to start thinking of ways to divert violence from our protests, because in Snohomish County, we were in Marysville doing this one specifically. We will always be outnumbered. It doesn't matter how we can bring in every organization from Seattle, every organization from Tacoma. We will never be in a safe space. We'll be in a safe space amongst each other.
Right.
But there are not places like this. There is no building that is a place where Black people in Snohomish County can go, and that is a safe space.
Right.
So we had to decide how we were going to rally the community behind a protest that was flying the Black Lives Matter banner and was looked at as a problem. How do we get people on our side? And we decided that we were going to have the conversations that nobody else was having. Rather than, when the guy drives by down the street and starts flipping us off or starts throwing hand signals at us, the next time we see him, we say, hey man, come here. Why did you do that? And we get into the conversation. And what happened was we had not one violent event. Usually that was precipitated with some sort of violent, like some sort of act that could have been taken as violence. We always diffuse the situation by having the conversation. Because ultimately people don't have, what we've learned about where we live is that people don't necessarily believe what they believe with they don't have a lot of background on why they believe
Conviction.
that. They don't have a lot of conviction. They were listening to whatever version of Rush Limbaugh exists now. I'm sure there is one. Tucker Carlson or whoever, and they're getting their information and they're making very quick decisions.
Right.
And usually fear will do that to you. And if we just, and the thing is, we looked the part. That was another thing. We were armed. We were in a position of trying to defend ourselves. So we probably looked terrifying, honestly, now that I think about it. But that's what we felt like we had to do to stay safe. But what's happening is the people that saw us as one thing, we had the hard conversations. And there were so many opportunities for things to go wrong. But per conversation, we got better at it, better at it, better at it. And before you knew it, we had no incidents. Zero. It was to the point where people were driving past us and giving us the thumbs up and saying, we really love what you guys are doing. People were bringing their children out to look and say, look, kids, this is what you can do in America. It really reinforced the idea that we need to have the conversations with our enemies, not just sit in a group of like-minded people, which is very effective, which helps you prepare for the conversation, but you can't just talk amongst yourselves.
Right.
It's
Would
really.
they join you all? I'm sorry.
We had some join. We had people that would come out with signs that were the opposite of what we were doing, and they would try to stand among us, and we would have to talk to them and be like, listen, we're not saying that you can't protest, because that's what you want us to do. We're not saying you can't protest. We're saying that this is not, you're at the wrong protest. Feel free to go over there or over here. This is where we are. So now that you know where we are, you can be here. And usually a conversation would start, and that person would instantly run out of gas and just go,
Right.
because their reason of being out there was to what's the word? What's counter protest,
Yeah.
which is amazing. And that leads me to the next thing I learned was that activism. I don't even want to call it activism anymore. I want to call it pro-activism. A lot of people fashion themselves activists over the past 5 years by reposting things online or by donating money to Black Lives Matter or by putting a bumper sticker on their car.
Self-proclaimed.
And we're with you, like it's like being a sports fan. It's like putting like a Seahawks shirt on Fridays and being like, I'm a Hawk. Well, we learned that proactivism is something where you are actually doing the work, not slacktivism, not couch activism. But and this is not for everybody. It's very important that when I say these things, I'm not trying to belittle anybody who is administrative or who works in the legal sector, the civic sector. It's all extremely necessary and extremely valuable. But those people who don't have the skills to work in that lane, I think it's very important that they understand that activism is something that you stand on these feet, whether or whether you're disabled or whatever means you have to be involved, to be physically, emotionally involved, intellectually involved. You mentioned earlier that we had this big rush of people at the beginning of in the past 5 years even, we had this big rush of people that were ready for the pageantry of the entire thing and were super into it and wore the outfits and bought the scarf or knitted the scarf. And what happened was it turned activism into something that was a fad. It's not a fad. it's literally that feeling you get in your stomach where you're like, I should do something, and it is a positive, tangible direction to point that feeling. Yeah. And I think taking the single serving nature, or just the specific issue based nature out of it, and understanding that it's probably one of the only things that I think all Americans have in common, is that we can speak out for what we believe in. Those of us, some easier than others, but you can do it. And I think to fashion yourself, and this is just the way that I look at it, to fashion yourself an activist without actually physically or somehow using what you have in order to help the issue that you're concerned in is not activism at all. Yeah. And I mean, yeah. That's it.
I think you're right. I think that activism looks different on everybody. You know, we say do what you can, when you can, where you can. And so I fully hear you, where not everyone who is just reposting or tagging or doing something, that's not enough. You know, that's an aid. You know, it's definitely an assistance, and we need to help spread the word. But I think I want to go back to something that you mentioned also, when there were two things. You had this counter protester who's like trying to shame you for what you're doing. There's a psychological reason behind that. People hate what they don't understand. Yep. And to take the step to seek understanding is the first step. So kudos to you and your team for just saying, hey, let's have the conversation, and recognizing that the only reason you are counter protesting is because you don't even know what we're protesting for in the first place. Let me educate you and let you know where we are and why we're doing this. The other thing you mentioned is you were armed, and you probably, to them, you may have looked terrifying. I think it goes all the way back to us telling our own stories, because why is a black person armed a threat, but a white person armed is not?
Exactly.
You know, so we got to go back to everything that kind of led us to the positions that we're in right now, where in order to do what's natural to everyone else, it seems scary. And I think the reason, and this is me going like super deep, I don't have any statistical data behind me, but I think part of the reason that people get, I shouldn't say people, I want to be really clear. I think part of the reason that white people and people who are not black or indigenous take offense or get scared seeing people in positions of power that look like us is because they assume that we will do to them what was done to us. And as soon as that happens, they will then feel everything that we have felt throughout our entire existence as black and brown people here in America. I love this quote, and I always try to make it a point to share it, from James Baldwin. To be African American is to be African without memory and American without privilege. And I feel like that continues to happen every time we have policymakers who are in positions for decades and they don't change anything. We have the two representatives in each state. And so we have these issues that take place when people do not understand, when they don't take the time to say, hey, I don't know who you are. I don't know your lived experience. I don't know what you've been through when you were overseas. I don't know what you've been through when you moved to America. I don't know what you've been through living in a predominantly white space and not feeling like you can be yourself in that space. And you guys don't know my experience. But let's have the conversation and learn what that experience is so we know how we're showing up. I think one of the things that we did with our organization is when we sat down and we said to everybody, okay, what's your ethnicity? How did you grow up? Do you have any siblings? What was your community? What did your community look like? Because now we know that's how you're going to show up to everything. Because I believe, and I don't know if everyone else feels this way, but how you move in your own space will dictate how you hold other people accountable and what you think of them. So for me, I didn't grow up in a dual family household. I'm not the youngest. I'm the oldest of four. I've always had to be in control. I've always had to have everything put together for my siblings. I always had to be the person doing the right thing. So when I organize something, I'm super meticulous. I take my time. I have to make sure every detail is accurate. But my team has to know that about me. And when you know that about me, you will know that I'm not like a micromanager. I'm not trying to control you. This is organically who I am. And so the person across from me might be the youngest sibling of four people. And in my mind is like, I see my brother, like, oh, okay, we're going to need to work on this one a little bit, So we have to check each other. I think that's also part of this process in the last 5 to 7 years is recognizing that, again, going back, I can't control anybody, but we can influence them, you know, and give them the tools that they need. And then recognizing when it's appropriate to follow them. When do they lead? When do I need to take a step back? I think those are the things that I've probably learned the most in these last few years. But you're right. I mean, everybody, like you said, everybody touched on something a little bit different. I think it's just a matter of putting it all together and moving forward with good intentions so we can move as a collective and get the changes that we're fighting for.
I know that I've learned patience because, you know, I always wanted things to happen. And one of the things that I learned was that it takes time, because part of why I came into this space to take this job was that I thought it was going to be done in 4 years. I'm a planner by nature. So it's like 4 years, we're going to have this done. We're going to own the building. We're going to have money in the bank and all of that. And that wasn't from non-knowledge, it was just the expectation. But the characters changed. The city council was different. There were different mayors. The mayor that was on our side was ousted out of office, and so you had to start over again. And so I think those are the kinds of things that I learned in terms of what I was willing as a person to work on, and that things change, and that you have to not give up, and you can't let your progress stop because there's new players at the table, and you might have to start all over again. And I think and you have to have infrastructure. So, you know, those are the kinds of things that I learned, and that other things help. You know, the whole thing about what was negative, but the whole thing around Black Lives Matters actually changed in a good way for a lot of people, because I think they recognize that they can't take anything for granted. And that some of the expectations that we have aren't going to happen when we think they happen. And I think it encourages other people to rally the troops and to engage in something that they didn't think that they could engage in. And I think all of that, you know, in the Boys and Girls Club, we had this saying that to be somebody you never thought you could be, but somebody else did, and everybody was like, that's really confusing. But when you think about it, it's really true. You know, to be somebody you didn't think you could be, but somebody had a dream or a vision for you. And because of that vision, you became that.
Right.
You know, so I think that's important.
It goes back to what you were saying, like helping people dream, you know, giving people that push that they need.
I also learned that we don't, not only do we not all agree, Black people, but usually we're on the opposite sides of issues. And what you were saying about experience, where are you from, how did you grow up, all that, that has everything to do with it. I think as the more we're pigeonholed by the white world, the more we get these blanket fixes, these things that don't apply to all of us. That this is what you want. You get them speaking for us because we're a hive mind of some sort to them. And I think that I learned throughout these past few years that not only do I fundamentally disagree with a lot of the brothers and sisters that I meet, but that it's okay. And not only is it okay, but it is a wonderful practice to treat your people the way you want others to treat your people. To say, I respect what you believe. We don't agree, but what do we have in common? Because obviously there's something. And to find those commonalities and then push forward, you know, it's to meet. My co-founder is from Chicago. I grew up in the county that we are active in right now. I realize that some people in my situation might have gone the opposite direction, fully assimilated, and just, you know, which I've also learned that assimilating and then learning you were wrong is a lot harder than just going against, just being yourself and going against the grain. I've experienced that with a couple people where they have had a serious crisis of identity in their 20s, 30s, and I would never want to chew that bite. You know. That being said, and I'm long-winded, obviously, but that being said, you know, I dove into my own history. I unfortunately I was young and I studied the wrong people at first. I was like Huey P. Newton and like you know, Stokely Carmichael and all that. And I might have gone a little extreme for a little while, but what it did was that it gave me the tools that I needed, just my experience young, to operate in Snohomish County and to understand exactly what I was up against, because I've been doing it my whole life. Where my partner from Chicago, he has been operating in Chicago, which is one, it is a completely different world. And our opinions balanced have been the key to our success. And that collaboration was enough for me to open my eyes and go, you know what? I don't have to agree with Stacey Dash, or I don't have to agree. I had to drop that one. No, but you don't have to agree with these people. You know, it's their experience, and our goal is to make sure that all of us can speak from where we're coming from and be accepted. It's not our job to define it.
Exactly, to be accepted. I love that you said it's okay for us to disagree and still respect each other. And I think that's what this whole movement is about. There are people on both sides, white and black, who are for this, and white and black who are against this. We can disagree, but if your disagreement is rooted in my oppression, then we have a problem. If you're continuing to perpetuate these systems that continue to keep us down, that is when I have the problem. But to disagree and still have conversation in a respectful tone and be able to be candid with each other and fellowship in that process, that's necessary, because you might change my mind. You know, I might change your mind, where we're now thinking the same way. But I also think you mentioned a few people that you studied when you were younger. I think something that's missing, and it keeps, everything keeps kind of going back. I love that this conversation is so interconnected in every way, to telling our stories, right? Going all the way back to telling our own stories, where something that is missed in modern day education is they tell the story as if Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were against each other. They worked coincidentally, like they were a team. They collaborated on everything, and they knew, just like all four of us know here, that each of us has a different method and approach to reaching the same destination. You know, we don't have to walk the same road. We don't have to do things the same way, but we know we're going to see each other at the end of whatever journey we're taking. So I have a bunch of people that are like, okay, yeah, I like this organization because it's not race exclusive. Cool. As long as you know we're going to the same place they're going, come on board. We're driving the same way. And some people might say, oh, you know, I want to work with this organization because it's women run. Okay, cool. Go with that. I want to go here because it's all men. I want to go here because it's white men. I want to be like, whatever your thing is, find your niche and just recognize that we're all going in the same direction. We're just taking different routes to get there. And so there are a lot of people that kind of forget that and think, like, I'm going to digress for a second. I had a lady write on a Facebook post of mine, Martin Luther King would be so upset with you. He would not be marching with you.
Wow.
And in my head, I was like,
because of the
do you know him?
Not being race exclusive, is that why?
So I don't know what it was for. It was just, I had said something about, you know, it was about politics. Like, hey, if you don't agree with these politics, you have the right to vote. Let's vote them out. Most of these politics are not in favor of black and brown people. Like, just being honest. Like, this is what it is.
Another black person?
It was a white woman.
Oh, okay.
It was a white woman that said, you know, Martin Luther King would not be marching with you. And in my head, I'm like, you're not marching with me, but whatever. But, you know, I think it was just about how do we explain to everyone who got the wrong information that the people that were marching and fighting for our rights, not only were they all killed by the government, but they were all working together. And they had mutual respect. It's how you perceive them. Just because you perceive them differently doesn't mean they were wrong, or that I'm wrong, or you're wrong, or so-and-so is wrong. So being able to show the whole picture, have people zoom out and say, hey, okay, I'm not going to focus on this little part of the painting that I like the most, but let's zoom out and see the whole picture. And all of us are in it every time. Every single group, every single person who represents our interests is in that picture. But we have different people that focus so much on little parts. I'm trying to speak metaphorically, if you will.
That's beautiful,
but
So I'll just say that people can show up by being good allies, working together, be willing to be in partnership, and also to understand what your role is. Because sometimes what happens is people jump into it and they think they're the leaders. I know at one point when we were trying to get the building that we had a group of men show up, and they were like, well, we'll take you to City Hall and we'll lead this. And, you know, I haven't said this, but I'm a feminist. People don't use that word so much. But no, you haven't been involved in the struggle with us, so you can't lead anything. And so I asked some of our members, because they were like, Diane, we're going to go down to City Hall, da 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 da, and he's going to speak. And I said to them, why would you choose him to speak? What does he know about our struggle? And then they thought about it. And then when he showed up and this group of men showed up, they didn't have anybody to take with them. And I said, you know, one of the things about being a partner and being an ally is you have to know your role, and you have to understand that. And certain things you can't speak for. I don't try to speak for everybody. And so I think that that's really important. And again, I'm the collective action person.
Yep.
Numbers and being in partnership and having allies and doing it together, you're stronger, but you also have to have an understanding, and your vision has to be in agreement. Your stylistic things don't necessarily have to be in agreement, but you have to be in agreement of what the goal is. You know, our goal was to get the building and to own it, and to make sure we had a deed of trust. That was our goal. And so all the other stuff, you know, people always say to me, because I'm a very priority focused person, it's like, I can't work on that because right now this is the priority. And you have to help people understand that, and you have to educate, and you have to train. And so my whole thing is just have allies, understand what the vision, the goal is, be willing to have some setbacks and some disappointments, and train people and bring people up behind you. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really important to our success, our collective success.
Right.
Love that.
All right, I'll jump in.
Let's go for it.
I'm going to focus on what people who are not Black can do. Because we get this question with Legally Black because we're not a race-exclusive organization. We believe that we need the open, notorious, and collective effort of all people to help reach these changes, because we don't have the power in most spaces. But the first thing, because people ask, what can I do? How can I show up? What can I do differently? Is to first understand and recognize that you are not impacted by these systems that we're fighting to change, and own that. Mm-hmm. This is not about you. Mm-hmm. There is space for you to help, but your voice is not paramount here. I think that is the very first thing that needs to be addressed. And also understanding that when we talk about our history, when we talk about the trauma that we've experienced, when we talk about the systems that are in place that continue to restrict us, or that have restrict our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents, etc., it is not an attack on them. Just because we're having these conversations does not mean we do not value your presence here. It just means that this is vital for us to acknowledge in order for us to move forward and get the changes that we need. I think sometimes, and I think we mentioned it before, people who are not Black assume that we're attacking them when we're bringing up the past. It is not an attack. No one is blaming white people alive today for racism. Nobody is blaming anyone for the systems that are in place today, but every single person who is alive today has an opportunity to impact what the story will be tomorrow. And that is where everyone needs to come together. I think as Black and brown people, where we can show up for each other is, again, recognizing where somebody else may be stronger in a certain area. If we're not all taking the same route to get to the same place, like I mentioned before, but who is better suited to fulfill this role at this time, and let's follow that person. We don't need to all be individual leaders like you mentioned. Where there's someone in place for those positions already, let's use them and activate each other, but also motivate each other, celebrate each other. I think if we continue to look at our own history in a negative light, it becomes discouraging, not just to ourselves, but to white people who are trying to help as well. There's room for celebration in this fight for liberation, and there's room for reflection, and we have to do both. I think those are the things that people can do to really show up and recognize that, going back to white people right now, you are going to be uncomfortable, so you have to get comfortable in that space. We have been uncomfortable our entire existence. You will have to take direction from somebody who doesn't look like you, and you have to be okay with it. And if you're not okay with it, it's not our job to make you feel okay, because our focus is not coddling you and making you feel better. That's not to say we're here to manipulate and hurt you, but our focus is simple. Liberation for Black people, liberation for Indigenous people, and other organizations may have their own desires for other people. But in this space, this collective space that we all share, if you are not a person who's negatively impacted by the systems that we're fighting to change, you have to get in line and know that you are not in the first seat. You do not run this. You can help based on what we tell you we need, but you are not an expert in what we need. And to accept that we're not attacking you, but we're not going to coddle you either. That's what I think people can do to show up.
Good. Picking up on that point, so just going back to the institutions and the funders, just sticking to those spaces, I guess I would say. I think about just exactly what you just said. Who are the experts? It's the folks who the policies and the practices need to impact, or things need to change on behalf of those people. Those are the experts. So we are the experts, right? So what does it look like to have people like us at the table to actually be engaged and to actually offer the solutions that can then be implemented, is what I think of. And I'm saying the institutional folks as well as the funders, because oftentimes you hear, this is what we want to do, or there's a crisis, or we need to change things, but they want to impose upon you what it is they think is best for you. And so what does it look like to really put the experts at the table and really listen and then to work with those folks on implementation and eventually see transformational change, because that's what we're all looking for. And but it's been incremental, because either it's the stop and go because you have different folks at the helm, or it's just not being done well, I guess I would say. So I think that would be my call to action. Just it's not the people, but it's who we need to foster some change.
What we need, we need support. We need funding. Our organization, because we represent such a tiny, below 3% community of Black people in Snohomish County, we are not just overlooked, we're basically invisible to the grant world, to any Black focused allocation of monies or anything, because we say, well, we're serving a total community of 45 to 60,000 people. There's more people than that in one block in most cities that represent their community. And so the need doesn't seem immediate. But I say the opposite. We have an isolated community. Many who have kids and are in danger of completely forgetting their culture altogether and not having the opportunity to even learn about it. To have that crisis of identity when they get older. And we believe that because there are so few of us, that with just a little bit of the ability to have a facility, to have a safe space, to have anything, we could actually reach that small number. The small number makes, we believe, our goals more achievable, not more distant. And so translating that in through the minutia and red tape of the grant world, or trying to get support and funding, is virtually impossible, because you don't check one box in the requirements. You have 20, 50 other great organizations that are serving a much larger community that are going to fill that place. So maybe just support is what we need. We need partnerships. We need people to understand that what happens in Seattle, King County, Pierce County for Black people doesn't magically trickle down to all of the satellite communities like ours within Snohomish County. And I know for a fact that one of the reasons that we were invited to be a part of this and the Black Future Co-op family is because one of the directors is from Snohomish County and knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it's a battle we're going to keep fighting, but I welcome anybody who understands the achievability and also the desperate need of support that we're calling for, because we need it terribly.
What type of support do you need specifically?
We don't have the ability to, for example, if we had our original view with Think Ideas, the reason we're called Think Ideas is because we were going to build a community center, a small, not even build, a small place where at least we can say, Black people, this is home base. If you need something, anything, come here. If you need a place to meet, if you need anything, this is the place. Not only is there not a safe space, actually, these things don't exist.
Right.
And they're so far off the radar of any politician, of anybody. The existing organizations that we have are derivative of national organizations. They're just doing the national organizations' work within our community, which is great, but there's no boots on the ground.
Right.
There's no boots on the ground, and we want to be those boots. We joke. You've seen the movie I'm Gonna Get You, Sucker?
Yeah.
We joke that the Black Liberation, remember the office where he has the bean soda? That's what we want. We just want a place that people drive by and go, if I'm Black, I'm in trouble. I can probably talk to those guys.
Right.
Right. I need, my son's girlfriend recently moved here with him and needed a place to get her hair done in Snohomish County. And all I could think was, I don't even know if any place is still there. We don't even have a home base. And we're trying to make the home base.
Right.
We're trying to find a place where we could all just be connected. Like I said, our community can fit in the Climate Pledge Arena. Our entire community. We can reach them. It's possible. And we don't, and real estate in Marysville is very cheap. I'm looking at which camera's on. It's very cheap. And
If you need a broker.
He needs all of us to move.
We see these organizations in places, in larger places, and we can't exactly follow their blueprint. We can't do it.
So I think one of the things we should take away from this is that there are people within this network that could work with you on that.
Yes.
And that'll be our commitment, is that we will work with you. There are resources in Snohomish County, and there are hairdressers. And I know someone who just bought some property in Marysville. So I know some Black families in Marysville.
Great.
So I think the collective I'm not committing you to anything, but through this process, that those are some solvable kinds of things.
Yeah. And we've been able to get some work done, but it's been us. Like there really isn't a greater community that is really galvanized and together where we are, and so it's been, we just that extra push. Yeah. That's all we really need as an organization. Thank you.
Yeah. I just have one last thing to share with you. I think you're in such a good position because you represent a small demographic of people in a smaller county, in a smaller area. Having that isolated community is actually the perfect opportunity for you to reach out to Governor Inslee and say, try it here. See if it works. And let us be the first community that you try these new experiences with. We're not afraid to be the first. I think a lot of times policymakers just want somebody else to be the first and then they follow up. I get frustrated with that, but it might benefit you in that space. And then you mentioned, just having like different people, you representing a certain demographic, us not being a race exclusive organization. I think it's also important to recognize that when you have disagreements with somebody who's not of the same race or ethnicity or background as you, it is not because they're racist. It is not because I don't like what you said in this organization. Let me be more specific. If you have people in your organization or people who follow your organization who are not negatively impacted by the systems your organization is focused on changing, and they have comments or ideas that you don't agree with, it is not because you don't agree with them because they're white. It's because they're not culturally relevant for what your organization is specifically designed to do.
Yes.
And I think for people who are not white, they need to be prepared for that and not say it's, what is it, reverse racism or something?
Reverse discrimination.
Yeah, like does that? I don't even know if that's a real thing. The counter protest, reverse this. They just always got to one up something, and it's just it's frustrating. But to recognize that you can disagree and still respect each other. It does not always mean that this Black person is racist towards you because you don't feel the same way as them. Hopefully that translates the way that I'm trying to make it convey.
It does.
Yeah.